most expensive things that a facility has to go through. So it actually costs more long-term if we have a cut in funding or a lack of stability in funding that leads to this uncertainty. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Huizenga?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one question. Are we talking about any specific cuts that have been made right now, or are these just all hypothetical?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So the continuing resolutions that are passed at the federal level have created this real, as Senator McMorrow said, era of uncertainty for providers. There have been some inability to receive information from the federal government after certain layoffs have occurred. They did, issue letters stating their commitment to uphold FAFSA, but did not mention Pell, for instance. So there are some really big questions that place when families are trying to plan for their future, make it very difficult for them to rely on investments that have a several decades long history given the new environment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator McCann?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to just go back to Pell Grants for a little bit. As I'm chairing the higher education community colleges budget, we've built a huge scholarship program for the Michigan Achievement Scholarship and the Community College Guarantee in an attempt for us to get to this 60 by 30 attainment standard, which is not unreasonable and very important for us to stay leading as a state in educational outcomes, but also being competitive. So we've seen a blip in the FAFSA operations, I believe. And you just said that you, in the CR, that the Pell is not necessarily a guaranteed spoken to issue, but we're building all of our aid to help Michigan families see lower costs on Pell Grants. So, when you get to cost of attendance built off of Pell Grants, then doing Michigan Achievement Scholarship or Community College Guarantee, that all feels like it could be a house of cards if the Pell Grant situation somehow becomes even into question, because as you said, the uncertainty is a big problem to start with. So, we've done smaller things in our budget, ombudsman for financial navigation. We're talking about trying to really beef up FAFSA completion. But what happens if we do FAFSA completion incentives, but there's no Pell Grant that goes with that? So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but it certainly gives me great fear of what this chaos could bring.
I want to just add that right now for the Michigan Reconnect program, we've spent $128 million in federal funding and nearly $25 million in state funding. So we really rely on the connection with the federal government and the infrastructure that comes with the administration of Pell Grant and PASFA in order to leverage taxpayer dollars in the most responsible way for our scholarship programs.
Thank you.
I left out Michigan Reconnect, so that also is how we're retraining our adult workforce, and it's been extraordinarily successful. So, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Bayer?
Well, I actually have a question about the Pell Grants only, and I don't want to even duplicate anything you said because it was a lot of really important points. I was a Pell Grant recipient, and I would not be here if it wasn't for that. There was no way I was going to be able to go to college without that kind of assistance. And so I look at the number and it seems fairly small relative to the huge problem that we're facing. But, how many people would not go to college without that? How many people whose path? Now we know that half of our students are living at the poverty level or below. How are we ever going to make that up? 169,000 people.
Yep, 169,000 recipients in Michigan right now.
Tragic. Thank you.
I'll just add, Senator, that we really leverage the efficiencies of scale that the federal government can, undertake with the FAFSA. There's tax data at a federal level important to ensuring that the students who need the resources the most have access to them that we wouldn't have at the state level. We simply can't duplicate the work that they're currently undertaking.
Thank you. And Senator Bayer, your comments remind me of the work that you've done on the Promise scholarships, which are last dollar, and the Pell Grants make a huge difference in making sure those students receive higher education at an affordable level. So thank you. Okay, and thank you both for coming before our committee. We appreciate you. Next, we would like to invite Dr. Michael Rice, who is the state superintendent, to give us an overview of the impact of federal funding cuts to Michigan's education program. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Rice. And Dr. Rice, we'll have about 10 minutes for a presentation, and I want to make sure we leave room for questions for committee members. And don't forget to turn your microphone on.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Thank you.
That was an earlier gift to you, Chair Anthony, that you couldn't hear me. Chair Anthony, members of the committee, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. Is that working or not?
Not yet.
We're still on Pell Grants. We haven't shifted to nutrition, Title I, and special ed.
No. No.
Tell me this isn't taken out of my 10 minutes.
It is, but go ahead. You can keep it pushing. Just because we have other committees that are meeting today. So you can go ahead and get started.
All right. Chair Anthony, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to present before you, and thank you for your commitment to public education. We have the responsibility to serve all children in Michigan public education, no exceptions whatsoever. And the federal cuts to public education put that mission in jeopardy. I'm going to run through some federal funding and federal cuts overview. I'm going to pivot to potential federal cuts in nutrition, Title I, and special education. I'm going to pivot to U.S. Department of Education cuts, and then finally bring it home with especially vulnerable populations. Federal funding and federal cuts overview. On the left, the Pac-Man shows you that we are 89% funded by state and local revenue, 11% by federal revenue. MDE is 50% funded by federal revenue, the half state and other revenue. Here are the elements of federal funding, piece by piece by piece, summing to $2.272 billion. On January 27th, the Federal Office of Management and Budget paused for 2 weeks federal grants and loans, and a day later, a multi-state coalition, including Michigan, filed a lawsuit against that pause. The Michigan Department of Education submitted a legal declaration in support of this lawsuit brought by Attorney General Nessel and her colleagues. The pause has been pushed back on. The pause has been paused, if you will, senators, but that's the least of our worries moving forward. Recent federal cuts include cuts to food programs, the local food purchasing agreement program, the local food for schools and childcare program, $1 billion nationally, $30 million in the state of Michigan. Recent federal cuts include cuts to the regional educational laboratories, which help the state education department and ISDs with capacity building. Recent federal cuts include cuts to teacher preparation and high impact leadership grants. Recent federal cuts include education research and data reporting cuts. Cuts to EdFax, cut to the What Works clearinghouse. And then we get into proposed funding cuts. Proposed funding cuts to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and proposed federal cuts under House Concurrent Resolution 14, which suggests $330 billion worth of education cuts nationally over a 9-year period of time from 2025 through 2034. Potential federal nutrition funding cuts. You know, senators, because you have helped fund Michigan School Meals Program. Universal meals for public schools have helped us increase breakfast by 26% last year, have helped us increase lunches by 20% last year. That's a big deal, and we appreciate that. More importantly, our students and families appreciate that. But there are proposals to cut federal nutrition programs substantially. And to cut federal nutrition programs leads to one of three possibilities or a combination thereof. One, the state could end up paying more to fund the Michigan School Meals Program. Two, families could re-begin to pay for meals in certain cases. Three, school districts could bear an additional expense, or some combination of the three. Federal nutrition programs are also being explored for cuts in SNAP and Medicaid. Each of these would have an adverse impact on Michigan children and families. Potential federal Title I funding cuts. Title I began in 1965. 60 years we've had a stability of funding in Title I. We received $535 million in Title I Part A funding. If there were to be assigned a 10% cut, which is small compared to some of the things that are being bandied about in Washington, that 10% cut, that $53.5 million cut, would be a 374 teacher cut, all else being equal. These cuts, by the way, would disproportionately adversely affect poor and working class communities that disproportionately receive Title I funding. Potential federal IDEA special education funding cuts. So we receive $450 million in federal special education IDEA funds. Federal IDEA dollars fund a whole host of different things, including statewide, the Michigan Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Technical Assistance Center, which has been working with us on our literacy/dyslexia effort in the state, statewide autism resources and training, special education mediation services, the Alt-Shift program, supports for blind and visually impaired children and students who are deaf or hard of hearing, parent supports with the Michigan Alliance for Families, and Michigan's alternate assessment system, the My Access system. $450 million if you were to take a hypothetical 10% cut. Remember, we talked about $330 billion over 9 years. If part of that is a cut to federal IDEA funding, 10%, that's $45 million. That's more than 300 teachers across the state. By the way, the feds have never made good on their promise to fund 40% of the added costs of special education. They've never made good on that. And they're going to cut off a deflated base. U.S. Department of Education staff cuts. I don't spend a lot of time advocating for federal bureaucracies or any bureaucracies for that matter. I do spend time advocating for children. And you should know that when you go after a skinnily funded federal department, you are going after school children. Last week, the U.S. Department of Education announced a 50% cut, a de facto 50% cut in staff. 2 days later, a multi-state lawsuit, including Michigan, led by Attorney General Nessel, filed a complaint, 53 pages, in opposition to this action. Far from being a first step, the complaint reads, the layoffs are an effective dismantling of the department. The Department of Education is essential. Plaintiff states rely on the department for an extraordinary array of programs. The department provides funds for low-income students and students with disabilities. It enforces the laws that prohibit discrimination in education. It administers federal student aid programs, which you just heard. Incredibly, all of these significant and statutorily mandated functions were covered by a lean staff of only 4,133 people. The reduction in force is so severe and extreme that it incapacitates components of the department. This massive reduction in force is not supported by any actual reasoning or specific determinations about how to eliminate purported waste in the department. Rather, the reduction in force is part and parcel of an opposition to the Department of Education's entire existence. When you go after the department, I'm not talking about a surgical cut. I'm talking about a wholesale cut. You're going after children. So let's talk about especially vulnerable populations for 2 or 3 quick minutes. Recently, the numerous executive orders have led to significant disruption in our schools, created unease among many, not all, but many of our students' families and schools, and have created a measure of uncertainty and confusion in our schools, greater than any that I have seen in my career of 4 decades, with one exception. The 1982 Supreme Court decision, Plyler v. Doe, made clear that all children, regardless of citizenship, regardless of immigration status, have a right to a free public education. That is not my opinion, although it is my opinion. That is a Supreme Court precedent. We do not card children at the door. We don't have the right to card them at the door. Every child has the right to a free public education. And we've put out guidance in that regard. Because surreally, folk were not aware of Plyler v. Doe 2.5 years ago. It was just naturally assumed that if a child showed up at school, he or she had the right to a free public education. And of course you educated that child. But it's a new day and people have new questions. Previously, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, stayed out of schools. ICE went after bad guys where bad guys were, but protected areas included schools, hospitals, and places of worship, temples, mosques, churches. But ICE has made clear that it can go into schools to enforce now. And so you've got children and parents that are concerned. And because they're concerned, there are issues around attendance. We also put out guidance on diversity and inclusion because the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights put out a Dear Colleague letter on Valentine's Day of all days to tell us that so-called DEI programs were illegal. Let me be clear. We are talking about diversity, meaning difference, and the richness of difference, not the stigma of difference, but the richness of difference. We are talking about inclusion, which is a welcoming the new 6th grader to the lunch table, welcoming students with disabilities into general education classrooms in a least restrictive environment. And we are talking about equity, fairness. That's what we're talking about.
And Dr. Rice, I'm going to let you have a few more moments.
Yes, ma'am. I'm bringing it home. I'm bringing it home.
Thank you.
So when the department put out guidance to indicate, Chair and members of the committee, that anything under the banner of diversity and inclusion was illegal, we took exception to that because much of what takes place under the banner of diversity and inclusion is not zero sum. No one loses. No one is preferred so no one loses. And if no one loses, Senator, there is no discrimination and no violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'll give you one example. Diverse classroom libraries or diverse libraries in a school or a community. Nobody is harmed when you diversify a library. Nobody's talking about taking Shakespeare or Faulkner off a shelf. We're talking about adding Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni and Gwendolyn Brooks to the shelf. And then I leave with one additional thought. If we are truly about all children, senators, we are about LGBTQ plus children as well. You can't argue you're about all and exclude particular groups of children. They're all ours. Every one of these babies is our children. Now that may be inconvenient or difficult in certain circumstances, but they're all ours. They all deserve our protection. And if that's not clear, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, the state Civil Rights Act, should make that real clear. I'm going to leave with one thought. When I met with a group of children, LGBTQ plus children, a few weeks ago, and I asked children at the end, what do you want me to share with adults about what you are experiencing now? One of them said to me, tell them that we are people too. I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. All right, members, are there questions? Okay, Senator Irwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Rice, for being here and for your sobering presentation. There are so many threats facing our schools right now because of the cuts and the chaos and the threats of cuts, and so I'm glad that you're being so attentive and helping us understand those and prioritize them. For me, the one that really sticks out are the potential cuts to Title I. And, you know, we know that Title I funding has been a lifeline for Michigan students and families that are struggling with poverty, and they've met a very real need for districts all over our state, including school districts in my district, schools that my own children have attended. And they provide benefit in Republican and Democratic districts. They've been supported by Republican and Democratic administrations, and now we're hearing that there might be cuts. So, you know, I think this funding is a testament to our commitment that every child, regardless of their socioeconomic status, deserves a high quality education. So can you share any more specifics about, you know, who you think benefits from Title I funding, you know, the potential impacts that we're going to see on these populations if this funding is slashed federally, and, you know, whether there's any possibility for us to be able to make up that large of a potential hole in such a critical area?
So Title I funds our poorest communities most substantially. A lot of schools, a lot of districts receive Title I funds, but the bulk of the funding goes to the neediest communities proportionately. So cuts will be disproportionately raining down on the neediest communities. Flint, Saginaw, Detroit, my former district, Kalamazoo, Benton Harbor, Muskegon, Muskegon Heights. There are a number of districts which are poor, which have high percentages of Title I funding.
Thank you. Senator DeMoose.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation. You know, recognizing that some of these proposed cuts, no question, would be devastating. Some of them are probably in order, but we also have no real say, at least officially, in what happens in the federal government here within this body. That said, it's true of almost any organization that there's some level of fat. If some of these cuts do come down to us, how much do you believe that you could find that could be cut from the Michigan Department of Education or school funding in general without causing significant harm to our students or educational outcomes? Is there any savings that could be found anywhere in the system?
So the department's budget is $164 million. It's unrelated to the distribution of Title I funds or IDEA special ed funds or nutrition funds to local public school districts. So even if the department disappeared, it wouldn't benefit backfilling local school districts. So that's one. Two, Michigan public schools are underfunded. It is true that you can look in any particular organization and make arguments against a particular position or a particular program, without a doubt. But in general, in aggregate, Michigan is underfunded compared to the highest achieving states in the country.
Thank you. Senator Camilleri?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rice, for the presentation. One of the things that you mentioned, I think, is very concerning that is happening in our communities. Just a couple weeks ago, one of our residents was picked up by ICE, who is a resident who has a legal work permit, and he was picked up a block away from Arthur's Middle School in Trenton, and he is still sitting in detention. And he was dropping off his son, who is autistic, at middle school. And right after he dropped off his son, ICE agents in an unmarked car came and picked him up, drew their guns when he didn't do anything wrong, and has a legal work permit and is now sitting in an ICE detention facility. Our schools are becoming places where people can be targeted, and it is a really sad, sad state of affairs. The thing I wanted to highlight in addition to that is thinking about how these federal cuts may affect the teacher pipeline and some of the teacher to student ratios that we're dealing with. You know, what message does it send to our educators after all this work that we've done in Michigan on a bipartisan basis to improve our teacher pipeline, that those types of programs could be cut given the fact that these federal dollars do help support our overall state budget?
Well, Senator, first of all, thank you for lifting up the story in your local community. I read about it in the newspaper. I appreciated what you said. I don't think it sends a good message to educators, as you well know, being the educator that you are. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think the message is that we have to push back and we have to say that education dollars are important. There are probably some institutions somewhere that can suffer cuts and still predominantly get their mission done. But Michigan public schools aren't well funded as a rule. And so for them to suffer federal cuts and substantial federal cuts would not benefit us. It's one thing to have small movements on the margins of federal budgets. People understand that. You know, budget goes up a little, it goes down a little bit, jitterbugs a teeny bit. That's not what we're talking at all. We're talking, I mean, you saw the concurrent resolution, $330 billion over 9 years. I didn't make that up. They passed that. Reflect upon that. And so I just ask you to think about not simply what might be, but how we can push back against these cuts. And I'm not talking about any particular person or any particular political party. If you think these cuts, irrespective of your political party, would adversely affect Michigan public school children, I think you have a responsibility to say so to your congresswoman or your congressman, to your U.S. senator, or to the president and his advisors directly. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Albert?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Dr. Rice, for your presentation today. Always a pleasure when you're in committee. First off, I wanted to also thank you for the recommendations you put out and drawing attention to the potential lost instruction days that students are receiving. That was very helpful information to put out there, that we have up to 22 days that students could be missing of their 180 days of instruction. So thank you for your leadership on bringing that to the forefront. So I just wanted to put this into perspective for people. If you look at the governor's exec recommendation, there was $2.4 billion of federal funds that was appropriated. Now, if you took the extra funds that we have in the school aid fund, that's on top of year to date, you had $2 billion right there. And if you look at various reserve funds that have been unspent for various things, or lapse funds that haven't been spent, I could find money within a very short period of time to backfill 100% of the federal funds that are out there. That being said, it's way too premature to be having conversations like that because, as you've indicated, there's uncertainty. We don't know if certain items are going to be cut or not. I just think it's worthwhile to put things in perspective a little bit and let people know we have money to make sure we fund the programs that we want to do. So that being said, have you had any conversations about if we were to do away with certain line items at the federal level, if they would replace it with general block grants to the state. That's been brought up, at least in various conversations publicly. Have you, in your role, heard of any potential block grant scenario that states could be receiving?
I have heard of block grants, but typically block grants are code for cuts. And so I think there's a value to doing some block granting, okay, to be clear. I think there's some value to fewer lines, but I don't think that there's a value to substantial cuts around fewer lines. Fewer lines and fewer dollars are two different things. The latter fund school staff and school programs. The former are simply lines on a budget. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the reserve funds to which you refer are in many cases, are in some cases designated and in other cases not, but meant for a rainy day. And presumably that rainy day shouldn't be a manufactured rainy day, but rather should be a day when unhappily the heavens opened up rather than someone ushering in rain on local public school children and local public school staff. So I agree with you that there are some things that might be able to be done in terms of block granting at the federal level, but that block granting shouldn't be code for cuts in federal funding. I do not agree that you can easily amass dollars in the state budget that wouldn't adversely affect other elements. You can pull from one, but you end up adversely affecting, you can pull from one and benefit another, but you harm that initial.
And we're
so
going to leave
just
it there.
reflect upon that. Yeah, I apologize.
Thank you. No, it's okay. We're going to leave it there just in the interest of time. So thank you. Thank you, Senator, for your
Thank
question.
you. I would just, if I could, Chair.
You cannot.
I was
We have a
remiss.
couple.
This is
Hold on. Wait one second.
This is Dr. Susie
I'm gonna
Cornell,
Go
my
ahead.
Chief Deputy Superintendent and former Urban Superintendent, #2 in the department. She
Okay,
is
sir, thank you
terrific
so
and I
much for being
appreciate her.
here. We
Thank you.
appreciate you. All right, we will now turn it over to our Attorney General, Dana Nessel. Thank you so much. Come on up, AG.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present to you today, Madam Chair, and to members of the committee. Specifically, I know that what you would ask me to come here and do is to talk a bit about the federal actions that have been filed by my department in the last few months since President Trump was sworn in for his second term in office. But I'd be remiss before I begin not to address the fact that this morning, two of my predecessors took the time to testify before a subcommittee over in the House. And what kinds of actions we file and when we file them at the Department of Attorney General was part of the conversation. And they indicated essentially that, that I am filing cases that they would not have filed. And my response to that is, good. That's why I ran for this office. I ran for this office to protect the people of the state of Michigan against trespasses committed against them by the federal government. And I will do that each and every time that we see two factors exist. Number one, when the federal government violates the law, when they are implementing their policies in a way that is illegal, whether that means that they're violating federal regulations, federal laws, the Constitution, the Administrative Procedures Act, et cetera, et cetera. Number two, that violation of the law creates some sort of harm, a specific concrete injury to the state of Michigan or to the people of the state of Michigan. And so my aim is not to try to undermine healthcare for people who live in our state, not to discriminate against our state residents, but rather to protect the people, their families, the individuals who live in the state of Michigan. And that is what I've been doing during the course of the filing of these federal lawsuits, and since I've been in office these 6+ years. So to review the cases that we brought, the first case involves an executive order that was signed by the president his first day in office, where he essentially sought to eliminate birthright citizenship, which of course is expressly written into the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And he did so using an executive order. A flagrant violation of our Constitution. The 14th Amendment was amended back in 1868, proudly so for the state of Michigan, because it was a former Michigan Attorney General and former Michigan Senator by the name of Jacob Howard who introduced that. And it was for the purpose of ensuring that the children of people who were born enslaved in this country would be American citizens. There have been 2 cases that have gone to the United States Supreme Court to confirm the legality of birthright citizenship. But President Trump sought to undo it with a mere striking of his Sharpie onto this executive order. So clearly unconstitutional, but what harms suffered to the state of Michigan? Well, last year, approximately 6,000 babies were born who required birthright citizenship because their parents were not American citizens. Those 6,000 babies, but for this case, would have been stateless, meaning there would be no country to which they would have belonged. But it also, in addition to just the abject cruelty of that, it would have caused Michigan to lose critical federal funding for those children. Those babies would no longer be eligible for Medicaid. That would cost the state about $11.6 million. Would not be eligible for the federal enumeration at birth program. And that would cost the state about $4.82 million. Loss of funding for the maternal outpatient medical services program. And that would have included about 1,907 babies that were born in 2024. So very harmful to those 6,000 babies, but also harmful to the state of Michigan. I should say that there were 2 different cases that were filed by 2 different sets of attorneys general. In the case that was filed by some of my colleagues out in Washington, the Reagan-appointed judge issued a ruling, I think within the first couple hours afterwards, said in his 40 years on the bench, the most flagrant violation of the Constitution he had ever seen in his career. Our next case that was filed involved the Office of Management and Budget. Oh, and I should tell you, there is a preliminary injunction on the birthright citizenship. That case, there's been a request by the Department of Justice for the Supreme Court to evaluate whether it should only apply to the states that brought cases and not a nationwide injunction. Fortunately, those babies born in the state of Michigan will be protected because of this lawsuit. Next, case that involved the Office of Management and Budget. On the evening of January 27th, there was an executive action that was taken by, I believe, the acting director of the OMB, indicating that there would be a pause on federal funding to the states. And what did this pause include? That began immediately the next day. Well, much of the 42% of Michigan's budget that is federally funded. As you might know, and I'm sure everybody who's here on this committee knows this, Michigan taxpayers and Michigan businesses pay over $30 billion to the federal government each and every year. We get that money back to us in the form of these federal programs. So what are the programs that were to be indefinitely paused? Well, that includes Medicaid, which of course we have 2.6 million people in Michigan who rely on at a cost of about $20 billion. CHIPS, the Children Health Insurance Program, over $314,000. SNAP, 1.5 Michiganders rely on that. That's about $13.2 billion. Head Start, 42,000 children are enrolled. That's about $425,000 in funding. The FEMA money that goes to the Michigan State Police, $52 million for disaster relief. I could go on and on and on. We literally filed this case within 24 hours of that memo coming down. Our claims were that it was a clear separation of powers issue, as well as multiple other claims. This money was properly appropriated by Congress, which still exists. I know it's hard to know that from time to time, but they still exist and they still are to perform a role, and they're the ones that create this budget. Gets passed through both chambers of Congress and signed by the president, but in one fell swoop through this memo from the Office of Management and Budget, we were told we would not receive that money anymore. We received a temporary restraining order, I believe within hours of having filed this lawsuit, and as a result, the federal government was told that they had to reinitiate the funding. I should also add that this happened so quickly and so suddenly that there was no notice at all given to program participants here in Michigan. There was no notice given to our state agencies. There was no notice given even to the federal agencies that actually administer the programs. Even they did not know that this would happen. It was chaotic. It was harmful to our state, and we've had to file 2 motions to enforce the court's order because still there is funding that has not been reinitiated so far and that we have struggled with. So that was our second case. Our third case involved the National Institute of Health, which there was a memo that was put out by the NIH on Friday, February the 7th. Our staff worked is that intentional, Senator, or no? Okay. I'm mad too. Why did,
And just a reminder, we only have a few more minutes left before our committee has to break,
Okay.
but keep going. I'm sorry.
I'll go as quickly as possible. That Monday, Michigan led. I was proud to have Michigan lead this case against the NIH. Clear violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. These were carefully negotiated contracts. You know, we have in Michigan, let's see, 18,000 NIH supported medical trials that are being conducted in Michigan, cancer studies, epilepsy studies, studies involving post-traumatic stress disorder outcomes for veterans. This would have resulted in an immediate loss to University of Michigan, $181 million. Michigan State University, $27 million. Wayne State University, $18 million. That doesn't even include all of the other programs, of which I don't have time to go into, but there are multiple other universities, other hospitals, other healthcare systems. We got an immediate TRO to ensure that the funding would continue and that we wouldn't have to stop these medical research programs and the medical trials upon which, you know, an untold number of people are involved in these medical trials who would die, literally die without this. So we immediately received relief, and that case is ongoing. And thank God that we did file that lawsuit, because I don't know what the results would have been to so many people, the harm that would have come to so many Michiganders had we not done so. The next case that we filed, I know I don't have much time, but it was a case against Elon Musk and Doge that we filed in the District of Columbia on February 13th. This was to stop Elon Musk and the individuals in Doge that were going from agency to agency and agency, collecting our private and personal data. These are individuals that were not vetted. It was they had not gone through systemically to make sure that these were secure servers that the information will be downloaded on. We now find out that that information has been shared with some AI programming. What kind of information? All of our social security numbers, our bank accounts, for people who have Medicare or Medicaid or various other programs, their personal private healthcare data. The list goes on and on. This is an appointments clause violation in accordance with our claim. That means that Elon Musk was never formally appointed, was never confirmed by the Senate, which anybody who is the head of an agency has to have confirmation by the Senate. And yet Elon Musk making determinations as to not just agencies, entire agencies shutting down, but the termination of federal workers, the selling of government property. That case is ongoing. The court has indicated that she believes it's highly likely that we will win that case. And sadly, we're having a significant issue in the case because the Department of Justice has been caught on multiple occasions, specifically lying to the court about who actually operates Doge, despite Elon Musk bragging on multiple occasions about running Doge. We've had many submissions about who is really behind the scenes directing these actions. That case is ongoing. I think we're likely to win. How much more time do I have? More lawsuits to talk about?
If you just have a few more minutes, and then we'll open it up to some questions.
All right. The reduction in force lawsuit that we filed on March the 6th. We have in Michigan nearly 30,000 federal employees. Now, what are our claims? Multiple, but violations of the APA, which requires a 60-day notice to terminate employees. Also that the termination, the mass termination of employees arbitrary and capricious. It doesn't just affect those employees, by the way, even though it very much affects those employees, but it also has a significant impact to the state of Michigan. The number of employees, hundreds and hundreds of them who have had to apply for unemployment insurance, who maybe could have gotten another job had they gotten their 60 days notice. The number of employees that have to apply for Medicaid through the state because they no longer have medical insurance. The fact that in one fell swoop, firing these staffers means that my own department doesn't know who to coordinate with. We were working with some of these people, whether it was on Superfund sites with the EPA, whether it was on some of our anti-robocalling lawsuits with the FTC. These people just suddenly disappeared. There was no notice to the state. There was no notice to our state agencies about where these people were going or, hey, who's the new person that you're supposed to work with? They just disappeared overnight. And that has a substantial impact on the state of Michigan, not just in the ability of these individuals to get a job, many instances in which the Office of Personnel and Management lied and said it was a performance-related issue that they were fired, when in fact they had only gotten good performance reviews. That impacts a person's ability to get a new job and also impacts local economies when these people can no longer afford to go out shopping or go out to dinner. So it has other kinds of impacts on the state as well. And from our review of this, totally arbitrary in nature, no rhyme or reason as to who was fired and who was not. And in addition, and again, I know I don't have time, but the way that this is going to affect so many different programs in the state we've identified, including the sea lamprey mitigation program, which I don't know about all of you. I didn't vote, to enhance our sea lamprey population in Michigan. $7 billion in Great Lakes commercial fishing. It's estimated that if untreated, over 100 million pounds of fish will be killed by sea lamprey alone. That's just one consequence. I have like 20 others. I'm not going to list them right now because I don't have time. The Department of Education lawsuit filed on March the 13th, which Dr. Rice talked about at length, but we know that there are whole divisions of the DOE that deal just with the state of Michigan that have been completely laid off. And I don't know if it was mentioned, but the Civil Rights Division that is in Cleveland, and they work specifically with Ohio and Michigan. They're the ones that when your child who is deserving of an IEP and special programming that goes along with it, if they are denied the ability to get that special programming, who do they make a complaint to? I don't know. I don't know who they make a complaint to anymore because entire sections of the DOE have been laid off. And in terms of the money that would come in from the federal government to the state government, who do we go to for that money? I don't know. How is that money going to come to us? What is the process? When are we going to get that money? I have no idea because there's no one to administer these programs anymore. So that's just a snapshot of some of the work that we've done in terms of the cases that we've been involved in. I want to say really quickly, how many additional staffers have we hired to do this work? 0, none. My dedicated staff just works all night long and works all weekend long. How much money has this cost the state in order to save the state? Billions and billions of dollars. I have an exact figure for you. So far, it's $2,433. That's how much money we have paid out in order to file these lawsuits. And again, I think the results so far speak for themselves. I feel very strongly as though we are going to be successful in each and every one of these lawsuits.
Attorney General, thank you. Thank you for just sharing so much. We just needed an update on what's happening. And I would like to invite you back to our committee so that we have more time. And obviously, as these lawsuits are settled, we'll want to know more because this committee's job is to look at the state's coffers. And many of these laws. Thank you. All right. Senator McCann had a question.
I just wanted to, almost took the words out of my mouth. I just want to thank you and commend you for your efforts in your office. I had a coffee hour a couple of weeks ago, and about 90% of the concerns involved a lot of the issues that you've gone over and things I couldn't give good answers on because it was people who were upset about federal issues. So I agree. I think you're going to be successful, and some of these constitutional affronts are outrageous. So I just appreciate you. And as you said, your folks are working hard. You don't have extra people to do this, but thank you for standing in defense of Michigan citizens.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Albert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Attorney General Nessel, for coming in and presenting today. Appreciate you being in here. The federal government has 3 different ways it can pay for all of the spending that it does. It can use taxes, it can use debt, and it can use inflation. And the Inflation Reduction Act ironically pushed us over the edge and skyrocketed inflation. And it's incredibly tricky and difficult to put out that flame once it gets going. So I understand the cases you brought forward here today, but we have roughly $36 trillion in US national debt. When I think it was around 1980, we had roughly 34% of debt to GDP ratio. We're at 122% now. I think everybody agrees that we're on an unsustainable path. The amount we pay in interest alone is now one of the largest items that the federal government pays. This is hurting people. This inflation and reckless spending is hurting people. And I guess my question to you is, do you think the federal government has any responsibility to rein in this reckless spending?
Senator Albert, I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely believe there are places where fat could be trimmed. There are programs that perhaps are not effective anymore. There are, in some departments and some agencies, there are some workers that are just simply not needed. However, this is not the way to go about it. Firstly, if you're going to do it legally. Go through Congress where you're having those discussions, you're having those debates, and Congress gets an opportunity to vote on something that they are obligated to vote on one way or another for some of these things to occur. So for instance, eliminating wholesale agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, If Congress wants to get rid of what I believe is a very important agency that's brought back over $20 billion to people who have been ripped off and scammed all across the United States, they can get rid of it. But our senators and our congressional representatives, they have to have a say. It's a congressionally created agency, as is the Department of Education, and they have to vote, and then the president can sign this. My issue with many of this is that these are unilateral decisions that are being performed illegally. And if they were done in a legal matter, so be it. So be it. But have those discussions, have them be thoughtful discussions, so you're not literally just arbitrarily firing people and you don't even know what those people do. And then you have to find a way to contact them to call them back because you accidentally fired the wrong people. And have it be a person who has constitutional authority to make those decisions, and not just some individual who happens to be a giant campaign donor to the president who gets to go in marauding through all of our state departments and all our state agencies, making decisions without any degree of thoughtfulness or deliberation into whether those are good ways to trim the budget or bad ways to trim the budget. And some of that, if you don't mind me just expounding on that just for 1 second, the hit to our National Park Service and the fact that we know the National Park Service makes us so much money in the state of Michigan, and yet they've laid off so many rangers that, you know, Sleeping Bear Dunes brings in 1.6 million visitors a year, brings in millions and millions of dollars to our economy. It is a money maker. But yet they've fired enough people that they're probably going to have to downsize the number of people that can go to the federal parks. So that's an example of where we're going to, you know, something that made money for the state of Michigan and helped us from a financial standpoint. Instead, it's going to hurt us. Where are we going to make up for all the revenue that we lose because some of these federal parks are going to only be able to operate certain days of the week, or not for as long as the season, or you're not going to be able to allow as many visitors in. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Be thoughtful about where you're cutting the money from.
And I know you had a follow-up, Senator, but we have 2 other questions. Do you mind if I circle back? Okay, thank you. Senator Irwin?
And thank you for that answer, Attorney General. And I just want to very briefly point out that, you know, right now we're talking about increasing our national debt by $4.5 trillion. That was just approved. And I would also point out that I think concern about inflation and the national debt is universal. But if we're concerned about inflation, we have to be realistic about what drives it. And we have to understand that monetary policy injects multiple times as much money into the economy as federal fiscal policy. And so if we're looking back to the seeds of inflation, I think we need to look at when the Federal Reserve was keeping interest rates irresponsibly low during certain years. But I think we could have an interesting conversation about that. We've probably learned some things on both sides about why each of us think that inflation is driven by what we seem to be thinking is driving it. I think it's driven by money supply, which is much more coming from monetary policy. Having said that, I'm sorry. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your actions that you're taking against the reckless and illegal things that this administration is doing to harm our state. I want to ask you what I think is a hard question, and it's a question I've been getting from a lot of my constituents, but I know that you're not shy about hard questions. So one of the things we've seen happen recently is we've seen the administration straightforwardly violate court orders. And I'm hearing from my constituents who are concerned about an autocratic takeover of our federal government. They're seeing a president who's, firing the generals, firing the JAG officers, doing a whole lot of illegal things. And then they're seeing him violate court orders, the one entity that could maybe hold him accountable to the law. What am I supposed to tell my constituents? What advice do you have for us here in state government who are worried that even when the courts come in and say that these reckless and illegal actions are illegal or unconstitutional, that the current president will just do them anyway? What do we do then?
Senator, I share your concerns, grave concerns for our country. And the one thing I can say, you've had Democratic presidents who have been sued, you have Republican presidents who have been sued. But the one thing so far they've all had in common is that they have complied with court orders, including the first time that Trump was in office. And I ought to know because I sued him a lot. But that being the case, We are seeing something new where you have the president, the vice president, Elon Musk, and others repeatedly saying that they don't have to comply with court orders, or saying things like, well, this is a low-level judge. What? You just called a federal district court judge who was nominated by the president of the United States, sometimes his own judges, and confirmed by the Senate, a low-level judge whose order you don't have to respect. I've never heard that before, and that's also not the law. So it is a deep concern. Obviously, as I've indicated in some of these cases, we've had to file these motions to enforce because the federal government has not complied with court orders. But I will say, and we've started to see it already in a number of cases, are we inching closer towards what I would call a constitutional crisis? I believe so. The executive branch, again, we have 3 co-equal branches of government. And certainly, ever since the days of Marbury v. Madison in 1803, the executive is held to account by the judiciary for violations of the law, violations of the Constitution. So are there methods to enforce a court order? Yes, but it usually involves the U.S. Marshals, who then will bring whoever the defiant individual is who refuses to comply with the court order into the court to be show caused, to be held accountable, to have to say why they're not complying with the court order, and to have that conversation about how they're going to go about making certain that they comply with it. So in the event that occurs, which I think we're getting closer and closer to a show cause where somebody's going to have to be brought in and be, explain why is it that the court order has not been complied with, we'll see if the U.S. Marshals actually do their job or not, because they are under which branch of government? The executive. Maybe that wasn't thought out so great when they created that branch of government. I hope and I pray that the federal government will comply with the orders of our courts. Even Chief Justice John Roberts had to lecture the president, if you will, and say, by the way, stop threatening to impeach federal judges just because you disagree with their rulings. You get to appeal them if you disagree, but you don't get to impeach somebody because you don't like their decision or it was an adverse decision to what you wanted to do or you hoped for. So I can only say this. I certainly hope that we are not going to see a full-blown constitutional crisis. But, just like everyone else, the President of the United States and his actions are subject to judicial scrutiny, and the executive must comply with court orders, as must the legislature, as all of us must. And it's okay to complain when you don't get your way. It's not okay to openly defy the courts.
All right. Thank you. Senator Kleinfeld, did you have a quick question?
Not a question, a comment. And the reason the room is clear is health policy, and the votes are getting ready to take place, so I have to run out. But I wanted to say thank you for all of these federal employees, particularly the ones that got promoted so they were on probation for a new job, that have had stellar performance evaluations, to have letters sent to them saying that their performance was not up to par, has to be pretty dehumanizing. And we do enough of that for our government employees, and we forget they also pay taxes, just like everybody else. And so they deserve somebody like you to step up to the plate and recognize that, and recognize that they deserve the respect and the representation that I'd like to see our federal government show them as well. So I wanted to say thank you for that. I appreciate it. And yeah, I agree on the national debt. What I would say with respect to that is use the people in the departments that have the expertise. If you're going to give a signal that a percentage has to be cut, have somebody that knows something about that department in there making those decisions, not some 22-year-old kid with a backpack that has never been in that department before. With that, thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you, Attorney General, for being here today. We do appreciate it. Can you please circle back to some of the senators? Because I think there were some additional questions we just didn't get around to. So
I absolutely will. I will answer any and all questions that that people might have. You guys know how to get a hold of me. And thank you for providing me with the time to explain these actions. I appreciate it.
thank you. And again, I apologize for additional questions that we weren't able to get to. With that, Senator Irwin moves and Senator Shink supports that we adjourn the Senate Committee on Appropriations. Without objection, we stand adjourned.